You know, it's hard to believe, but just 5 years after World War II finally ended, the world was holding its breath all over again. That hope for a lasting peace, it was absolutely shattered, and it happened on this small peninsula in East Asia. This is the story of the Korean War. We're talking about the very first brutal, hot war of the Cold War, a conflict that would pit superpowers against each other and really set the stage for decades of tension across the globe. So, what was this all about? Well, right at the heart of it all was a nation literally torn in two. Think about it. After 35 long years of Japanese occupation finally ended in 1945, Korea wasn't handed freedom. Instead, it got this new, really tense division. And right from the get-go, you had the communist North and the capitalist South, and both of them were saying, no, we're the one true Korea. This wasn't just some political disagreement, it was an existential rivalry, and both sides were absolutely willing to go to war to prove their point. Okay, so how did we even get here? How does the supposedly temporary measure turn into two of the most heavily armed states on the entire planet? Well, let's dig in and take a look at how the seeds of this conflict were planted. Believe it or not, this whole division started back in August 1945, and it was really just a matter of convenience. The Soviet and US forces split the peninsula right at the 38th parallel, basically just to handle the Japanese surrender. But that temporary line, it hardened up real quick. By 1948, both superpowers had pulled their troops out, but they left behind these two brand new states. In the south, you had Syngman Rhee's Republic of Korea, and then just a month later, up north, Kim Il-sung declared the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So what started as literally just a line on a map had become this ironclad border between two really hostile nations. And make no mistake, this division was anything but peaceful. Long before the official invasion kicked off, that peninsula was already simmering. You had the North backing a communist insurgency down in the South, and both armies were launching these constant, bloody raids back and forth across the 38th parallel. This wasn't some kind of cold peace, not at all. It was basically a hot, low-level war, just waiting for a spark to make the whole thing explode. While that spark was about to be ignited by the incredibly ambitious leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung. He had this grand plan, reunite Korea by force. But he couldn't do it alone, not by a long shot. He absolutely needed the backing of his powerful communist patrons. So, Kim Il-sung goes to the top, right? He seeks the blessing of the ultimate authority in the communist world, Joseph Stalin. But Stalin, he's a bit cautious. His focus is really on Europe. He agrees to send over some weapons, including those all-important T-34 tanks, but he stops short of giving a full green light for an invasion. Soviet intelligence pretty much had Kim's number, though. They knew that while he was a disciplined communist, he was also incredibly determined, and he was going to look elsewhere if he had to. And that's exactly what he did. Kim found a much more eager ally in Mao Zedong, who was fresh off his own massive victory in the Chinese Civil War. And Mao gives Kim a critical gift, a force of 28,000 ethnic Korean soldiers. Now, these weren't raw recruits. These were battle-hardened veterans from Mao's own war. So we're not just talking about manpower here. This was a massive injection of real combat experience right into the heart of the North Korean People's Army, the KPA, a total game changer. Okay, so now Kim's got Mao's veteran troops, and he goes back to Moscow promising Stalin a super quick victory. And this time, it works. In January 1950, Stalin finally gives his approval. Why? Because he was convinced the United States just wouldn't get involved. But here's the thing. Stalin had made a fatal miscalculation. He had no idea about a top-secret American policy paper called NSC 68. This document completely changed U.S. foreign policy. It basically committed America to containing communism anywhere and everywhere on the globe, by any means necessary. The two sides were now, without a doubt, on a collision course. So, with the green light from both Moscow and Beijing, Kim Il-sung's plan was finally set in motion. And the rest of the world? Well, it was about to be caught completely, totally by surprise. Imagine this. It's 4 o'clock in the morning, June 25th, 1950. And the quiet dawn is just shattered. A massive, coordinated artillery barrage starts thundering across the 38th parallel. That was the signal. The full-scale invasion of South Korea had begun. And right from the start, it was a complete and total mismatch. Just look at the force comparison here. The North Korean People's Army, the KPA, had more than double the number of troops. They had tons of artillery. But the most critical difference, the real knockout punch, was this. around 150 Soviet T-34 tanks. The South Korean army, the ROK, they had zero. Absolutely none. They had no effective way to stop an armored assault. It was just an overwhelming, unstoppable force. The result? It was a complete rout. It was a steamroll. Led by those tanks that just seemed invincible, the KPA spearheads sliced right through the ROK defenses. The South Korean army, totally unprepared and outgunned, it just collapsed. The capital city, Seoul, fell in just 3 days. 3. But here's something you might not expect. The invasion wasn't universally feared, at least not at first. For some South Koreans, people who are really disillusioned with Syngman Rhee's pretty authoritarian government, the northern soldiers actually looked like liberators. As one civilian put it, they seemed like long-lost brothers who had finally come home. Seeing them talk quietly and laugh, no one was frightened. That initial welcome, though, it was not going to last. It would soon turn to terror. Yeah, the fall of Seoul triggered absolute panic, a chaotic retreat. For what was left of the ROK army, and for the first American troops now rushing to the scene, this was suddenly a desperate fight just for survival. And in all that chaos, a truly catastrophic mistake was made. In an attempt to slow down the KPA advance, South Korean forces blew the main bridges over the Han River way too early. And in doing so, they trapped 44,000 of their own soldiers on the wrong side of the river. In one single, disastrous move, they essentially crippled their own army. Okay, so the world started to react, and fast. The US 7th Fleet immediately steamed into the Taiwan Strait, trying to shield it from a potential Chinese invasion, which, as you can imagine, enraged Beijing. At the same time, over at the United Nations, something amazing happened. A resolution for armed intervention actually passed. Now, how did that happen? Critically, the Soviet Union, which had veto power, was boycotting the Security Council meetings at the time. It was a huge diplomatic blunder on their part, and it allowed for the creation of the first ever UN command, with 22 different countries pledging to send troops. The first American troops to arrive were rushed in from their cushy occupation duty in Japan. Now, you have to understand, these guys were not combat veterans. They were understrength, they were poorly equipped, and they were psychologically nowhere near ready for what was coming. This small unit, they called it Task Force Smith, was basically thrown into the path of the KPA advance near a place called Osan on July 5th. Their job? To be a speed bump, to slow the North Koreans down. Instead, they were annihilated. And this first-hand account from a soldier who was there, it just captures the absolute helplessness they felt. He said, "The tanks continued to roll down the road towards us. We had no way of stopping them. The tank scored a direct hit on the colonel, and he was killed on the spot." Their main anti-tank weapon, the bazooka, was pretty much useless against the thick armor of those T-34s. The rockets would literally just bounce off. They were facing a steel tide with weapons that just couldn't do the job. And the price for being so unprepared? It was paid in blood. In just 17 days, that's a little over 2 weeks of brutal, non-stop retreat, the first big American unit on the scene, the 24th Infantry Division, was just gutted. Take a look at this. They lost nearly a third of their entire fighting strength. They weren't just being pushed back, they were being systematically destroyed. And that retreat just kept going. By August, the KPA had conquered almost the entire Korean peninsula. The battered, exhausted remnants of the South Korean and the newly arriving UN forces were pushed into this tiny, desperate corner in the far southeast. It was a final defensive line that would go down in history as the Busan Perimeter. So there they were, trapped, with their backs literally to the sea. There was nowhere left to run. This was it. Could they possibly hold on? Annihilation looked almost certain. But behind the scenes, a brilliant and daring counterattack was being planned, one that could change the entire course of the war. To find out what happens next, you're going to have to join us for part 2.
All right, welcome back. So when we left off, things were looking really, really bad for the UN forces in Korea. I mean, they were trapped, their backs were literally against the sea, and the situation was just desperate. But as the title of this part suggests, the tide was about to turn in a huge way. Okay, so let's set the scene here. On the brink. By August of 1950, the North Korean People's Army, the KPA, had basically run the table. They'd pushed the UN and South Korean troops all the way down into this tiny little corner of the country. It was an absolutely dire moment. And this map, wow, this really shows you just how bad it was. See all that red? That is all North Korean control. And that tiny little blue box down in the southeast? That's it. That's the Busan Perimeter. That was the last line of defense. If that fell, the war was over. Everything was riding on holding that little piece of ground.
But, inside that perimeter, things were starting to change. The UN forces, now organized under the US 8th Army, were digging in. And crucially, help was arriving. Fresh troops, including the British 27th Brigade, and tons of new equipment were pouring in. They suddenly had a 5-to-1 advantage in tanks, like the powerful M26 Pershings. And, this is huge, they had complete and total air superiority. So by about September 12th, the KPA assault, which had been grinding on for weeks, it just burned itself out.
So the front is stable. What now? Well, the UN commander, the famous General Douglas MacArthur, he wasn't thinking small. He wasn't just planning to push out of the perimeter. No, he was planning a massive, audacious gamble, a knockout blow that was so incredibly risky, it was almost crazy.
And this was his thinking. I love this quote from him. He said it would be like an electric fan. You don't fight the blades, you just go to the wall and pull the plug. For him, landing at the port of Incheon, deep behind enemy lines, was pulling the plug. Cut off their supplies, and their whole army on the front line would have no choice but to just collapse. A brilliant idea, right?
So, was it even possible? Well, here's the catch.
Incheon was by all accounts one of the worst places on the entire planet to try an amphibious landing. Seriously, when MacArthur proposed it, his military planners were absolutely horrified by the idea. And you can see why they were freaking out. I mean, look at this list of challenges. You're talking about insane 30-foot tides. At low tide, it's not a beach, it's just miles of thick, impassable mud. The channel to even get there is narrow and treacherous. And get this, they had a window of only about 3 hours on one specific day, September 15th, to make the landing work. Oh, and the whole city was surrounded by high, fortified seawalls. It was just an impossible plan. But they did it anyway. Against all logic and all odds, on September 15th, 1950, the invasion fleet showed up, and the U.S. Marines of X-Corp went in. They hit what little beach there was and started scaling those massive seawalls, all while under heavy fire. MacArthur's incredible gamble was officially in motion.
And what happened next was just stunning. The landing was a massive, almost unbelievable success. It worked better than anyone could have possibly imagined. The North Koreans were totally blindsided. The entire war literally turned on its head in just a few hours.
And the effect was like a lightning strike. Look at this timeline of just 12 days. September 15th, they take Incheon. The very next day, the 8th Army smashes its way out of the Busan Perimeter. By the 25th, they're in the capital, Seoul. And just 2 days later, Seoul is recaptured and the two UN armies link up. The KPA was caught in a giant pincer. Their supply lines were gone. All they could do was run for their lives.
The result was the complete shattering of the North Korean People's Army. Think about that for a second. Just weeks before, they were on the verge of total victory. Now, their army was destroyed. Out of that entire massive invasion force, only about 25,000 soldiers even managed to escape back across the 38th parallel. So, with South Korea now liberated, the whole goal of the war changes on a dime. It's no longer about defense. President Truman gives General MacArthur the green light to cross the 38th parallel, to go on the offensive, and to finish off the KPA for good.
And man, the mood was just euphoric. The UN forces were just rolling north. The advance was so fast, they took the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, on October 19th. They were getting closer and closer to the Yalu River, which is the border with China. Everyone thought the war was basically over. The boys would be home by Christmas. Victory seemed inevitable. But across that river, a sleeping dragon was waking up. China was watching this advance get closer and closer, and they were getting very, very alarmed. And they were not about to just sit back and let it happen.
So you gotta ask, right? With the war so close to being won, what could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot, it turns out. Back in Washington and at the UN, everyone's celebrating. But in all that triumph and confidence, they were completely missing some really crucial signals. And to get what's about to happen, you have to put yourself in Beijing's shoes for a minute. China's leader, Mao Zedong, he isn't seeing the UN liberate Korea, no. He's seeing a powerful American-led army marching right up to his front door. He saw it as a direct threat, maybe even the first step of an American invasion of China itself. And this right here shows the fatal disconnect. On the one side, you have US intelligence, specifically MacArthur's chief, confidently telling everyone Chinese intervention is unlikely. On the other side, you have the reality.
Mao has already decided to intervene. He even sent warnings through diplomatic back channels, trying to tell the US to back off. And those warnings? They were completely ignored.
And that ignored warning, it led to this number, 225,000. By the end of October, nearly 250,000 soldiers from the Chinese People's Volunteer Army had secretly poured across the Yalu River, melting into the mountains of North Korea completely undetected.
They were like ghosts. They moved only at night, hiding from the UN planes during the day, deep in those freezing, rugged mountains. They weren't just there to defend the border, no. They were setting a massive trap, and they were waiting for the perfect moment to spring one of the biggest, most devastating ambushes in the history of modern warfare. The war wasn't ending. It was about to enter a terrifying new phase.
Welcome back. In this third part of our Korean War Explainer, we're diving headfirst into the brutal winter of 1950. You know, this was a season that promised a quick and total victory, but instead, it delivered one of the most shocking and desperate turnarounds in modern military history.
So, what happened? How did it all go so wrong so fast? Let's start right at that moment of peak confidence for the UN command, a time when victory didn't just feel possible, it felt absolutely inevitable.
Okay, so picture it. Late 1950. After that genius move at Incheon and the breakout from Busan, the mood among the UN forces was just electric. They had completely shattered the North Korean army.
And the UN commander, General Douglas MacArthur, he really summed up that feeling. With the enemy on the run, the belief, and it was a widespread belief, was that the war was basically over. The troops would be home for the holidays.
And boy, the advance was relentless. South Korean forces poured across the border, the US 8th Army grabbed the capital, Pyongyang, and by late November, American soldiers were literally standing on the banks of the Yalu River, looking right across into China. The end was right there.
But as these troops pushed up to the Chinese border, they were about to meet a brand new enemy, one that was completely unexpected and incredibly deadly. The dragon, as they say, was waking up.
The first attacks were sharp, they were brutal, and honestly, they were really weird. Chinese troops, who were called volunteers, so China could deny they were officially involved, hit like a sledgehammer. And they used these terrifying tactics, blaring bugles and horns in the middle of the night to cause pure chaos. But then, just as fast as they showed up, they vanished.
And right here, this was the fatal mistake. You know, his own intelligence chief was warning him about a massive Chinese buildup, and his troops just got a serious bloody nose. But MacArthur, he thought China was bluffing. He ordered his home-by-Christmas offensive to just keep pushing right to the Yalu.
So get this. While the UN forces were advancing into what they thought was pretty much an empty battlefield, a massive Chinese army, we're talking nearly 250,000 soldiers, was hiding in the mountains, just waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap. And on November 26th, that trap slammed shut. The main Chinese counteroffensive just crashed into the overextended, totally unsuspecting UN forces. This quote from a soldier, man, it just captures the sheer terror of that moment, as this triumphant advance turned into an absolute rout in a heartbeat.
And nowhere was this fight more desperate, more brutal, than in the frozen mountains of eastern North Korea. This is where the US X Corps found itself totally cut off, around a place that would go down in history, the Chosin Reservoir.
Now, this really highlights MacArthur's super controversial decision to split his forces. The 8th Army over in the west got mauled for sure, but they could at least retreat. X-Corps in the east, though, was operating all on its own, and now it was completely cut off, surrounded by an entire Chinese army group, a catastrophic situation. And on top of fighting a massive, determined enemy, they were also fighting one of the coldest winters anyone could remember. We're talking about morphine freezing solid in syringes, rifles seizing up, truck batteries dying. Frostbite was actually causing more casualties than enemy bullets. It was, literally, a frozen hell.
This haunting message from Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, whose unit was just completely swallowed up, it tells you everything you need to know about the desperation. Trapped, outnumbered maybe 10-1, and literally freezing to death, units just like his were wiped out in unbelievably savage close-quarters fighting.
And this number, it just shows the horrific price they paid. Out of 2,500 men in what was called Task Force Faith, only 385 even made it back to the main perimeter able to hold a rifle. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a pure struggle for survival.
So now, let's look at how these surrounded forces somehow, against all odds, managed to fight their way out. This would become one of the most legendary withdrawals in all of military history.
I mean, to the outside world, this just looked like a total disaster. The headlines were grim. The assumption, really, was that the tens of thousands of men in X Corps were doomed. They were finished.
But this legendary quote from the Marine commander, Oliver Smith, it just perfectly captured the incredible spirit of the guys on the ground. They weren't giving up. No way. They were going to fight their way out, and they were going to bring their wounded, their dead, and all their equipment with them.
And this was the insane plan, an epic fighting retreat. Every single mile of that 78-mile road to the sea had to be fought for. Their air support was their absolute lifeline. And, get this, in an unbelievable feat of engineering, they literally airdropped entire sections of a bridge to repair a mountain pass the Chinese had blown up.
The retreat finally ended here, at the port of Hungnam. And in this massive sea lift, they not only evacuated over 100,000 troops, but also nearly 100,000 desperate North Korean civilians who were fleeing the communists. An incredible achievement, for sure. But it was the final, definitive end of the UN's drive north.
So by the time 1950 came to a close, that dream of a quick victory was completely dead. The entire strategic picture of the war had been violently, totally redrawn. This quote from a British soldier, well, it pretty much sums up how a lot of the troops felt. Morale just hit rock bottom. America's allies were quietly pretty critical, pointing out that U.S. troops seemed way too dependent on roads and vehicles, and they just weren't prepared for the kind of brutal, all-around fight this new war demanded.
The UN Army was in a full-blown retreat, pushed hundreds of miles south, all the way back across the 38th parallel, right back to where the war had started. The war had come full circle, but now it was a much bloodier, way more complicated, and a whole lot grimmer than anyone could have imagined just a few weeks before.
This shocking reversal in the winter of 1950 basically set the stage for 2 more years of brutal, grinding warfare. We're talking trench lines, artillery duels, and bloody battles for hills that didn't even have names. It was a new, grim war, and that's exactly what we'll explore in the final part of this explainer.
Welcome back, everyone, to the final chapter of our Korean War series. The wild, sweeping advances of the early days? They're over. Now we're diving into the final, brutal phase, a grinding, bloody stalemate that kicks off in 1951 and lasts all the way until the bitter end in 1953.
So, here's what we've got on tap for this final part. We're going to dig into that stalemate and then look at the strange contrast between the high-tech dogfights happening in the sky and the brutal trench warfare down below. After that, we'll follow the long, frustrating road to peace and finally try to unpack the war's unending legacy. You know, after all that incredible back and forth we saw in 1950, the war just hits a wall. It enters this new, agonizing phase where the front lines basically freeze. The conflict transforms into a war of attrition, where progress is measured in bloody yards, not miles, and the cost in human lives just absolutely skyrockets. What's so wild about this period is the contrast. It's like you had 2 completely different wars being fought on the very same front line. You have this futuristic air war with brand new jet fighters happening directly above an almost archaic World War I style conflict down in the mud and trenches. Okay, so let's look up. High in the skies over the Yalu River, a chunk of airspace got a new name, MiG Alley. This became the stage for the world's first large-scale jet-on-jet combat. You had American F-86 Sabres dueling with Soviet-made and often Soviet-piloted MiG-15s. Now, the MiG could climb higher and turn tighter, but the Sabre had a more advanced gun sight, and critically, the UN pilots, many of them World War II vets, often had the decisive edge in training inexperience. This quote is just incredible. It captures that visceral, high-speed combat, but from a Soviet perspective, a side of the story we rarely get to hear in the West. It's a powerful reminder that behind the controls of those MiGs were real, highly skilled pilots fighting for their own cause. But, you know, for the infantryman on the ground, the guy in the trench, his experience could not have been more different. Down below, the war wasn't about speed and cutting-edge technology. It was about mud, it was about endurance, and it was about sheer, gritty survival. And this quote from a Colombian officer, it just perfectly captures the pure terror of that trench warfare.
See, battles weren't being fought for big cities anymore. They were fought for these anonymous, strategically minor hills with names like Old Baldy or Porkchop Hill, names that became totally synonymous with these desperate, meat-grinding struggles. For the soldiers, daily life was just a grim routine of survival. They were battling not just the enemy during these terrifying night raids and patrols, but also the brutal conditions of the Korean landscape itself. We're talking frostbite in the frozen winters, heat exhaustion in the humid summers, and on top of it all, the constant psychological drain of static war that felt like it would just never end. And the result of all that fighting? It's this staggering fact. Nearly half, 45%, of all American casualties in the entire war happened during this stalemate phase. Let that sink in. It happened after the front lines had largely stopped moving. It was a period of incredibly intense, concentrated lethality. You know, you also had these moments that highlighted the friction within the UN coalition. This famous anecdote from the Battle of the Incheon River is a perfect example. A bit of classic British understatement leads to this tragic miscommunication that leaves the Gloucestershire Regiment totally surrounded, forcing them into a heroic but unbelievably costly last stand. Okay, so with the battlefield completely deadlocked, the focus starts to shift. It moves from the trenches to the negotiating table. But as both sides were about to find out, trying to find peace would prove to be its own special kind of war. The peace process itself just became this frustrating 2-year marathon of starts and stops. You'd have moments of hope, but they were followed by these long periods of bitter stalemate where negotiators would literally sit in silence for hours, just staring at each other. And all the while, soldiers were still fighting and dying on the front lines. So what was the problem? Well, the single biggest obstacle to peace became the fate of thousands of prisoners of war. See, the UN argued for something called voluntary repatriation, basically the principle that a POW should get to choose whether or not to go back to their home country. But this was a direct ideological challenge to the communists. The idea of their own soldiers willingly choosing the West over communism was a propaganda nightmare they simply could not accept. This one issue became a proxy battle for the entire Cold War, and it dragged the fighting on for so many agonizing months. And then finally, on July 27, 1953, the guns fell silent. But the war's conclusion, it wasn't a true ending. Really, it was just a pause, a ceasefire that has frozen a conflict in time and continues to shape the world we live in to this very day. I mean, can you imagine? This powerful image from a Canadian officer captures the surreal moment the fighting just stopped. After years of trying to kill each other from trenches and bunkers, enemies simply emerged, stood out in the open, and stared across no man's land in complete silence. To even begin to understand the war's legacy, we have to start with a staggering human cost. For the host nation of South Korea, military casualties numbered over 600,000 killed, wounded, or missing, a devastating price. The international coalition also paid a heavy price. We're talking over 40,000 non-Korean UN soldiers who lost their lives. The United States bore the vast majority of those losses, but there were also significant sacrifices from countries like Britain, Turkey, Canada, and so many others. And on the other side, well, while the exact figures are debated and really hard to confirm, the losses on the communist side were absolutely immense. Conservative estimates put the number of Chinese and North Korean soldiers killed at 500,000, and some figures suggest it was actually far, far higher. But maybe the war's greatest tragedy of all was the civilian toll. With families completely torn apart and the entire peninsula devastated by bombing and ground combat, an estimated 2.5 million civilians became casualties. That number dwarfed the military losses of all the armies combined. So, the big question, who actually won? Well, the truth is, the outcome is deeply ambiguous. You could say the UN won because they defended South Korea, but they failed to reunify the peninsula. China preserved North Korea, but they also failed at reunification. Heck, even the Soviet Union could claim a win by bogging down its rivals at a pretty low cost. In the end, it seems like every side achieved a core objective, but nobody achieved total victory. The most tangible, physical legacy of the war is right here, the DMZ. It's this 250-kilometer scar running across the landscape that serves as a permanent, incredibly tense reminder of an unresolved conflict, a war that technically is still ongoing. And this all leaves us with a final, profound question. After 3 years of unimaginable violence and suffering, The so-called Forgotten War ended almost exactly where it began. It really forces us to ask, what was truly gained at such an immense and devastating cost? And that concludes our series on the Korean War. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. If you found this explainer valuable, please do us a favor and remember to like and subscribe for more deep dives just like this one.